Okay, well, welcome everyone. This is Marvin Swartz. I'm with the Wilson Center for Science and Justice and the Department of Psychiatry at Duke. And we're very excited today to have a conversation about the national opioid litigation. I'm sure people have heard a lot about it and read various accounts about it, but this is a great opportunity to hear from North Carolina Department of Justice about the litigation and the likely effects at the state and local level, and what kind of opportunities might develop from this. So our guests today are Deputy General Counsel Daniel Mosteller and Senior Policy Counsel Stein Mange. And the format we'll use is they will present sort of the core material for the first half, and then we'll open it up for questions. So Steve did want to make this a discussion, a robust discussion with us. So I would ask you, while they're talking to, or when you have questions, to just put them in the chat area of the slides, and I'll read them to Daniel and Steve when we get to that point. But the first part, he'll be presenting slides on the litigation. So without further ado, thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Steve.
Thank you so much, Marvin, and thanks so much for the opportunity to present today. Was really impressed with seeing the range of folks who are registered to be on the webinar today. And so appreciate the opportunity to share this information. I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see if I can pull that off. All right, I'm going to do one more thing. All right. I hope that everybody can now see the screen.
Yeah, that's perfect, Steve.
Fantastic. So Daniel Mosteller and I are going to speak briefly about why we're here. Daniel's going to talk for a while about kind of the national litigation and settlement landscape. I'm going to say a word about how we see that playing out in North Carolina. And then, as Marvin said, we're going to open it up to a discussion. And I'm fine, as Marvin said, with folks putting questions in the chat. I'm also more than happy, if it's okay with Marvin, for folks to pipe in as well. Sure. So why we're here in 3 quick slides. We're really here because of very high levels of drug overdoses in the United States that have been fueled by the opioid epidemic in particular. You can see there a major spike in 2020 in drug overdoses. I'm sure many of you read in the paper recent data from the CDC that in the first year of the pandemic, from April 20 to April 2021, opioid overdoses in particular approached 100,000 per year. And so we're just seeing a tragic level of overdoses, and every overdose, you know, we like to talk about fatal drug overdoses, but that is literally the tip of the iceberg. This is North Carolina data from DHHS, where basically every time you read about an overdose, there is, in addition to that, a hospitalization and approximately 3 emergency department visits, and 150 to 200 folks who are suffering with misuse of opioids. In North Carolina, we've seen over the last couple decades, more than 16,000 folks having died of drug overdoses. And just for a little bit of situational awareness, as many of you are probably aware, we're really looking at a 3-wave epidemic. The first wave really started with prescription drug overdoses. That is that light blue line that you see kind of leveling off. The prescription drug overdoses contributed substantially to a wave of overdoses from heroin that started around 2010. That's that dark blue line. And then, as everybody knows by now, the prescription drug and heroin opioid overdoses were followed by a really huge spike in overdoses attributed to fentanyl and other synthetic opioids. And that's that purple line that you see spiking up there to the right of your screen. And that very top line is just the sum total of all, any and all opioid overdoses. So we're here to talk about this major public health crisis that has been exacerbated substantially by the other public health crisis we're talking about these days, which is COVID. And so it is in this general landscape that we started to see states, local governments, and others bringing lawsuits against corporations involved in either making or distributing or selling opioids. And with that, I turn it over to my colleague, Daniel Mosteller.
Thanks, Steve. And so I'm going to start with giving sort of a broad perspective on the litigation that's ongoing, and then focus on two different sort of sets of litigation, one against Purdue Pharma and one sort of that's resulted in a large national settlement with the pharmaceutical distributor companies and Janssen and Janssen. So just as you see on this slide, there's three sets of types of defendants that have been brought into these lawsuits. They're manufacturers who actually manufacture the pill, so that's the column there. And several of those manufacturers have ultimately now filed for bankruptcy related to the opioid litigation. One, as I mentioned, Johnson & Johnson has now entered into a settlement agreement, and several others are still litigating, and there is no national settlement agreement. Then we have the pharmaceutical distributor companies, and they've all become, the three major ones have become parties to a national settlement. And then we have pharmacy chains, and those are all in litigation. And some of you may have heard there was recently in Cleveland, Ohio, in a federal court, a jury verdict against CVS, Walgreens, and Walmart related to two jurisdictions there, and litigation is ongoing against the pharmacy chains. So Steve, if you want to go to the next slide. So to focus in on Purdue Pharma, which I know has gotten a lot of attention, they're a well-known name. The Sackler family is obviously well-known, and then I imagine some on this call have watched the Dope Stick drama, or watched other things or read other things about Purdue Pharma. But Purdue Pharma, why were they sued? And these are the first three on this list are similar to other manufacturers and actually all the defendants. One, and this is the main reason why state AGs have become involved, because it's sort of a bread and butter kind of thing that state AGs, consumer protection groups, units look after, is it's false and deceptive marketing. And specifically with the Purdue Pharma and the other opioid manufacturers, it was false and deceptive marketing about the lack of abuse or the lack of addiction that would come with prescribing opioids, and the marketing was largely to doctors through sort of salespeople to doctors. There were also claims about funding front groups, so various kind of advocacy groups, that some more legitimately than others, that claim to be sort of patient advocacy groups or pain advocacy groups, and also just more generally sort of this theory of public nuisance. And so that the notion that just like an oil spill or sort of a more traditional kind of nuisance activity, that sort of they have flooded the market, they've sort of polluted the nation's medical system with an abuse of excess of opioids. And then finally, the unique nature about Purdue Pharma is the Sacklers' involvement, and the role that they played in the money that they sucked out of the company. So next slide, Steve. So here's sort of a bit of a timeline on the litigation against Purdue. And I've sort of moved this timeline. There was, and I imagine those that watch Dope Stick are aware, Purdue was under federal investigation and ultimately pled to some federal crimes in the 2007 period. So this is sort of post that. There's now been a second round of litigation, and mostly civil litigation, against Purdue, and which generally started, I think most people would say, in 2014, when the city of Chicago sort of started this sort of notion that local governments would sort of sue Purdue largely under public nuisance theory. It really got going in 2017, sort of up to, and by sort of 2017 and 2018, ultimately literally thousands of counties and municipalities across the country sued Purdue. You also noted here in 2018, and so state AGs also were suing Purdue, and then in 2018, Massachusetts AG brought a lawsuit actually against the Sackler family individually against their own assets, and that started an additional wave of lawsuits against the Sacklers. 2019, Oklahoma settled for $270 million. That was sort of the first major settlement out of this, and sort of based on that amount of money and sort of extrapolating it out, it became quickly clear that the amount to settle on a national basis and the amount of liability on a national basis was well beyond what Purdue had assets to pay. And so Purdue filed for bankruptcy in September of 2019. At that point, it was roughly the plan was sort of, we'll go into this, and Steve, you can go to the next slide. So this is the plan so there was a plan in September of 2019. Through negotiations, the plans actually got a little more, provided a little bit more money. And so the plan that ultimately was sort of negotiated among most of the state and local governments and had gotten bankruptcy court approval last fall would have provided that Purdue would pay all its cash on hand and its future profits. The Sacklers individually would pay approximately $4.5 billion and lose ownership of the company. And all that money, both the Purdue's money and the Sacklers' money, would go to fund remediation of the opioid crisis, would go to fund payments to certain personal injury victims that could sort of had filed claims about being harmed by Purdue's products and being sort of become sort of faced addiction based on a Purdue's product. And also, obviously, this is litigation, so there needed to be some provision for attorney's fees. And in that plan, what became the controversial nature of that plan was that it would allow the Sacklers to settle all of their civil liability, so that if the plan, as the plan sort of was structured, the Sacklers would put in this $4.5 billion, but they would not face any future lawsuits. They could face future criminal prosecution, but no more lawsuits, even against for creditors, whether it would be state governments or individual personal injury victims that didn't feel like it was enough money. So Steve, next slide. So because of the controversy over that portion of the plan, 8 state AGs, eight state AGs and the United States Department of Justice appealed the bankruptcy plan. Ultimately, where we stand now, a district court in New York City has found that the bankruptcy plan couldn't give those kind of releases and immunity to the Sacklers. And so the plan is now sort of on hold. There's both an appeal ongoing, a further appeal up to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, but also there's further mediation now going on between the Sacklers and the 8 states that appealed to see if a revised plan that presumably would provide for more money might satisfy some or all of those states. So sort of the ultimate question is that this raises sort of as an interesting legal question and an interesting policy question is whether bankruptcy can be a forum where entities that themselves are not bankrupt. So just to be clear, the Sacklers themselves have not filed for bankruptcy, but they want to use the related bankruptcy of Purdue Pharma, the company, to obtain sort of global resolution. So they're basically, what they've said is they'll put $4.5 billion on the table, but they're only doing that if they're assured that they don't sort of face future litigation risk. And so that's the question: is that something that the law allows? And And as we've seen between what the bankruptcy judge ordered and what the district judge in New York ordered, that is not a straightforward legal question. So that is the ongoing sort of debate there in Purdue. So that's the Purdue bankruptcy. Steve, if you want to go to the next slide. So now going on, one more slide, Steve. In the other sort of set of settlements that I want to talk about in litigation are settlements that have been entered with the 3 pharmaceutical distributing companies and Johnson & Johnson. So first on the distributors, some of you may have heard of these companies, some of you may not. You often, if you pay attention, you may see their, often you'll see their trucks on the interstate and whatnot, because basically these 3 companies are largely logistics companies. The bulk of their business is delivering the sort of transporting and delivering to individual pharmacies after the pills have been manufactured. And this is both true of opioids and all other kinds of medications, or even I think I'm right, McKesson has the contract to distribute COVID vaccine. So I mean, these are sort of broad logistics companies in the pharmaceutical space. And they make up as roughly 80, somewhere maybe even north of 80%, especially in controlled substances, of the distribution market for pharmaceuticals. And so part of what they have access to, because all these pharmacies are ordering from them, are vast data on pharmacy orders, including opioid orders. So if you want to go to the next slide, Steve. So the issue with that is under the Federal Controlled Substance Act, and most states have very similar state controlled substance acts. People that are involved in sort of handling controlled substances, whether it be the actual prescriber, whether it be sort of entity shipping it, whether it be the pharmacy that receives it, have various duties. And with respect to sort of these distribution companies, their duties are to identify, report, and not ship suspicious orders. And so the allegations are that they, because of all the data they had, because of all the shipments they were making, at times and in systematic ways, they ignored sort of red flags and that would have shown suspicious orders and shipped to various sort of pill mill pharmacies across the country. And there's sort of notorious examples, many of which are, I mean, they're all over the country, but there are a number of examples, for instance, in West Virginia, of pharmacies that basically had people in the parking lot overdosing on drugs, and people coming in paying for cash that didn't have legitimate need for drugs, and yet these distribution companies continue to ship enormous volumes of prescriptions to these pill mill pharmacies. So that's the theories on these, why these distribution companies are alleged to be liable. Moving to the next slide, Steve. There's also, as I said, Johnson & Johnson is part of the settlement as well, and they own one of their subsidiaries is an entity called Janssen, and Janssen makes 2 opioid drugs, Duragesic and Nucynta, and so like the other manufacturers of opioids, the allegations are they were involved in marketing deceptively and funding various front groups that sort of, broadly speaking, sort of made doctors think that opioids weren't as addictive as they were, and sort of this change in the culture and sort of the notion of sort of pain as a fifth vital sign, or sort of other sort of emphasizing pain management and sort of aggressive opioid-based pain management, and that the allegations are that was deceptive and sort of changed the culture of prescribing. So if you want to move to the next slide. So the actual litigation, so as I said, like with Purdue, thousands of states and local governments sued the distributors in Johnson & Johnson, among others, other entities. Most of these suits were consolidated into one sort of federal, one judge, Judge Polster in Cleveland, Ohio, a federal court there, was assigned most of these judges in what is sort of what's called multi-district litigation. And the way these kind of multi-district litigations work, that they're sort of exemplar trials, they call them bellwether trials that go to trial. And so the first trial, which was 2 counties, Cuyahoga and Summit County, I think Cuyahoga County is actually the county that Cleveland is within, were scheduled to go to trial in the fall of 2019. Ultimately, that case settled on the eve of trial, and for that one trial, so those two specific counties in Ohio, the distributors paid $215 million, and Johnson & Johnson paid $20 million to settle that trial. And so that was not going to be a sustainable. I mean, the companies all saw that they couldn't just sort of one-off settle cases for that sum of money and sort of have a viable path to global resolution of the cases. So, Steve, if you want to move on. So ultimately, there was an agreement after a lot of negotiations back and forth that those four companies combined would settle for a $26 billion nationwide settlement, paid over 18 years, although I'll note, and I know Steve will raise this on his portion, the bulk of most of the money comes in the first few years. It's not even over 18 years. It's very front loaded, especially the Johnson & Johnson money. So but it is a stream of payment over 18 years. Part of the settlement is extensive injunctive relief, so changes to the practices of the company going forward. And for Johnson & Johnson, the changes, Janssen and its Janssen unit no longer manufactures opioids. Johnson & Johnson and Janssen are out of the opioid market entirely, and they've agreed to continue to stay out of the market. And the way the settlements are structured, these settlements are unique in that because of the mass amount of litigation, but also because based on the legal claims at issue, it would be very hard to do it as like a class action or some other more traditional kind of settlement device that's used when thousands or tens of thousands of people sued. Instead, there's sort of a unique structure here where all the counties and local governments that have sued all across the country and all the states that have sued need to actually sign on to the settlement. And so you've got to create an incentive for them to sign on, and you've also got to create a penalty for them not signing on. And so that's when we talk here about carrots and sticks. And so the carrot is if states are able to get 100% or close to 100% of their local governments and the state government to sign on at the outset, they get more money. Like the $26 billion is only available if everyone signs on, and your state share of the $26 billion is only available if every relevant local government in your state signs on. So that's the carrot, is the more people that sign on at the outset, the more money that's coming into the state. The stick is if the settlement once the settlement goes into effect, if other local governments that didn't sign on now sue these companies, there's a significant loss in payment. So you've earned this money based on sign-ons, and if someone comes out of the woodwork to file a new lawsuit, you lose a lot of money. And so that's sort of the carrot and stick approach of these settlements. Moving on. So again, sort of about the $26 billion that's in the settlement, most of it has to be spent on future opioid remediation. There are very specific provisions about large portions of the money. It's well over half the money, and it's close to probably 70% of the money that has to be spent on future remediation. It's divided among states based on a national formula that took into account various sort of metrics related to opioids. So some of it's the volume of pills that went into each state. Some of it's about opioid overdose deaths that go in each state, adjusted for some data. There's actually, as probably many folks on this Zoom know, there's some real data issues with death data, especially state to state, and so there's some adjustments that can be made to make it more accurate. And also about some survey data on people with opioid use disorder is also part of this formula. And then each state gets to develop its own plan on how to allocate funds within the state. So it's a very, the settlement set up to be very much encouraging negotiations between local and state governments, and to reflect that different states are very different in how they fund their public health infrastructure. Like, and I know Steve will talk about this a little bit, but just to say, I mean, North Carolina has a very sort of county-based system of public health. Some, especially smaller states or states more in the Northeast, all the public health infrastructure may be state-run. I mean, Delaware, for instance, not a big state, only has 3 counties. The state government, my understanding in Delaware, runs a lot of either directly or indirectly, basically manages their public health infrastructure just because of the unique size of that state. And so we wanted to not try to have a 50. There was no way you were going to find a 50 state model that was going to fit every state. And so we encouraged negotiation. Dave, if you want to go my last slide. So what's going on now, as I said, we're still in the carrot phase of the carrot and stick approach. So roughly by the end of this month, I think it's actually sometime next, I don't remember the exact date, but it's by middle of next week, is sort of the last opportunity for county governments and city governments across the country to sign on. So we're in that phase. The companies will then get to decide at the end of that period whether enough signed on to constitute what they want to see as global peace. And if they give it the go-ahead, then payments begin in April this year is the first set of payments, and there's another round of payments in July. So money will be going out very quickly. So with all that, I'll turn it over to Steve.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for that whirlwind tour of the national litigation and settlement scene. I thought I would pick up here and talk a little bit about Daniel's last point, which is that every state comes up with its own arrangement of how to deal with the opioid settlement funds. And so here we are in North Carolina, beautiful picture there of Chimney Rock. I'm going to talk about 3 things, really: the allocation of funds, the use of funds, and accounting for the use of funds. And let me just say at the outset that we're fortunate here to have a very strong working relationship between the Department of Justice, the Department of Health and Human Services, the counties represented by the North Carolina Association of County Commissioners, and the cities represented by the North Carolina League of Municipalities. We have been able to work very cooperatively. And as a result of that, one thing we're proud of is the fact that every single county and every single city, medium and large city, which is what we need, has signed on to the national settlement. And virtually every one of those cities and counties has signed on to the state memorandum of agreement, which is what governs the use of the settlement money. And so talking first about allocation, Daniel mentioned $26 billion over 18 years and that was front loaded. The total sum coming out of the distributor settlement for North Carolina for that 18 years is around $750 million. As far as how that gets allocated, in this memorandum of agreement that was negotiated between the state, the counties, and the cities, 15% of the money goes to the state. That will be governed by the General Assembly, although it is subject to the overall stricture that the money be used to address the opioid epidemic. 85% will go to local governments, specifically all 100 counties plus 17 of the largest municipalities. And that too is governed by a formula, a distribution formula that was also determined at the national level. We just borrowed a formula from the national negotiations rather than trying to come up with our own formula. So how will that money be used? And I'm going to focus very specifically here on options that are available to local governments. The MOA essentially presents local governments with 2 options, option A or option B. They can actually pick option A or they can pick option B. They can pick a combination of option A or option B, and they can change their mind from time to time. But essentially, as I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a second, option A is a relatively short list of a dozen evidence-based, very high impact strategies that, in consultation with DHHS and other experts, we came up with. Option B expands the list of strategies beyond that short list of high impact strategies, but it also requires that counties or municipalities go through a rigorous planning process. And so I'll talk a little bit more about those 2 options. talking about option A, for those, many folks here I know are practitioners or experts. And so you will look at this list and you'll see a lot of very familiar strategies, evidence-based addiction treatment, particularly medications for opioid use disorder, various strategies to support people in treatment and recovery, like housing, employment, transportation, and so forth. Classic harm reduction strategies, including naloxone distribution and syringe service programs, and then a host of strategies focused on the criminal justice folks who are involved in or at risk of becoming involved in the criminal justice system, criminal justice diversion programs, treatment in jails, and upon release, as well as post-overdose response teams that are a fairly well-established way to try to connect at-risk folks to services they might need. Option B, as I mentioned, opens up a wider range of strategies. There is a fairly robust planning process that a county would go through, involving diverse stakeholders, looking at root causes, surveying existing programs, evaluating strategies, and so forth. Anyone who's done community planning around health issues would be very familiar with the process that is spelled out in option B. One thing I will say is, and there's a fair amount of discussion about this right now. I just got off a call with somebody in Charlotte who was asking me about this. I mentioned that you can do a combination of option A and option B. So for example, you could decide to spend, that there's an immediate need for naloxone, and to spend some of the funds that are currently available on naloxone. And you might say for the rest of it, we're not going to spend that money right away. We're going to go through this planning process. The other thing is, even if you just pick option A and your plan is to just pick one of those option A strategies, we obviously encourage everyone to go through some sort of planning process rather than, we definitely support the ready, aim, fire approach, not the ready, fire, aim approach to spending the opioid settlement money. There's a lot of questions we've gotten around the MOA, and I'm happy to address questions that might come up in the Q&A. Another thing we're very proud of, and I think North Carolina really stands out among the states, the state agreements in this respect, is a very high level of transparency and accountability. So before a state can spend any money, they have to not only set up a special revenue fund so that money is separately tracked and separately subject to audit. They have to pass a resolution worded in a very particular way to make it clear what strategy they're funding with that money. If they did do option B, there's a report and recommendations that comes out of that. And all of this information, the resolution or the budget item, any report and recommendations, all of this goes on a statewide dashboard. And the statewide dashboard is already up. You can look at it at ncopioidsettlement.org. Obviously, we don't have any of these reports yet because none of the money has gone out, but there's other information there. In addition, once the money has been spent, there's what I call after the fact reporting, both financial reporting and impact reporting, that will also be available on this opioid settlement dashboard. I did want to acknowledge, because I think I saw Steve Marshall from the UNC Injury Prevention Research Center on the webinar. We have this, the opioid settlement dashboard is a cooperative venture of the North Carolina Department of Justice, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the UNC Injury Prevention Research Center. There is some information up now. We expect within the next couple weeks to add a lot to that little tab you see called Data Dashboards, so that the dashboard can serve not just as a place that counties report information to, but actually a place where counties can go for data and resources and so forth. With that, let me just, this is really my last slide, wanted to make sure you were aware of some resources. The first is the dashboard that I mentioned. I would encourage you to take a look at it and share your feedback with us. The second is a lot of the legal information that Daniel and I have been talking about as far as the settlements, the MOA, and so forth are available at the Attorney General's opioid website, which is called More Powerful NC. If you go there and click on opioid settlements, there's quite a wealth of information there, including all of the the actual text of the agreements, summaries of the agreements, FAQs about the agreements, and so forth. And there is Daniel's email, my email. And so with that, I'm going to leave that up just for a second, Marvin, and then turn it back to you to moderate questions or any discussion.
Okay. Well, while people are looking at that, I encourage people to put into the chat questions they have, but thanks very much. This has been a really very clear presentation. We appreciate that. The first question from Nicole Schramm-Sapta is, the carrot stick approach seems reasonable at this point, but what's your estimate as to how likely it is that other cases will come out of the woodwork? So we'll accrete over time.
And so I'll try to answer this. I mean, hopefully they won't. If we've designed the settlement correctly and people are generally positive about how the money's going, I think sort of from I guess there's sort of two audiences we have to think about. One, just given this litigation has sort of been run, or has been sort of the local governments across the country and state governments have been the plaintiffs. Are the sort of actual county commissioners, attorneys general, city councils, are they going to want? Is anyone going to be interested in sort of filing additional suits, authorizing additional suits? I would hope if it looks like the money's going for good purposes, I would hope that county commissions and city councils wouldn't be eager to file additional lawsuits because they're going to be satisfied with how the money's flowing and that we've gotten some real relief from these companies to start sort of addressing or further addressing the opioid crisis. So there's that piece of it. I mean, as with any litigation, there's also just the reality that some of it's a question of, well, what incentives would attorneys have for bringing additional lawsuits, and whether they thought there was some additional sort of attorney's fee money that might be obtained by filing additional lawsuits. And the settlement, I haven't talked about the sort of attorney fee provisions in the settlements, but they're also designed not to incentivize additional litigation. There's a large pot of money, I mean, almost $2 billion that was sort of set aside for attorney's fees in this settlement, but it's contingent on people not filing additional lawsuits. So I would hope that it's been designed right also to not encourage that from an attorney's fee perspective. So far, I think we're feeling good about not sort of having the sense that there are going to be a lot of additional lawsuits filed and that people really have realized this is a sort of the global settlement, but it's to be determined. And obviously the companies sort of put in all these sticks because they were worried about that potential. So I can't say that it doesn't have any potential for happening, but I'm hopeful that it won't happen, that people will be satisfied with the settlement that's on the table and been negotiated.
Thank you. Thank you. So question here from Nidhi Sakdeva. Since Janssen is no longer making a couple of opioids, do you have a sense of how many pain patients might have been displaced?
So I think most of at least those specific drugs, I think some of it they aren't making anymore because they've gone to generic and they were sort of manufactured by Janssen when it was a branded medication, but now that it's gone generic, that it's much cheaper and being manufactured by some of the generic companies out there. So to my knowledge, the fact that Janssen has left the opioid market doesn't mean that that medication is no longer available, and in fact it may now be generic. And I know, I don't remember the name of the companies, but I know at least one of the manufacturing facilities that Janssen was using, I think in Puerto Rico, now manufactures pills for a different manufacturer. And so we did not hear, and I will say, there has been concern expressed in the Purdue bankruptcy, and in fact, some of the federal agencies, the DEA and HHS, have raised concerns in the Purdue bankruptcy about wanting to make sure that the fact that Purdue went into bankruptcy wouldn't mean that it would suddenly be liquidated and that OxyContin would just go evaporate out of the market. I mean, I think the DEA and HHS and the state attorney general and the local plaintiffs understand there is a place for, I mean, there are clearly many patients with legitimate pain issues and legitimate needs for opioids, and especially someone who's actually been prescribed OxyContin. It could be an abrupt switch if they had to go to a different medication. And so that's something that all of these injunctive provisions and the way these settlements have been designed isn't sort of designed to create a sudden shift where one manufacturer's prescriptions just all of a sudden become unavailable.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, Nidhi, thank you for that question. My understanding is consistent with Daniel's, that the impact of the litigation has not, I don't think that there are any formulations that suddenly went off the market due to the litigation. I think on the contrary, there's actually a wider variety of formulations available now. And one little interesting series of conversations that we've had is the one Daniel mentioned about OxyContin. A couple, 2 or 3 years ago, we had a conversation with some of the top pain docs in North Carolina, asking that exact question: what if OxyContin suddenly went away? And at that time, they expressed grave concern and said that while they only have a small number of patients for whom OxyContin was really the right formulation, maybe less than 10% of their pain patients, they said for those patients, you wouldn't want to suddenly have to find an alternative. Interestingly, we had that same conversation with the same doctors within the last year. It was sometime in, I think, 2021. And they had actually changed their tune somewhat. And they said, they would still never favor anything happening abruptly, but they pointed out that there were several additional products on the market that were very, very similar to OxyContin. And so that their panic level would be quite a bit less if OxyContin did suddenly go off the market. So I think, Nidhi, in sum, the answer to your question is we're seeing more options rather than fewer options for people with genuine pain.
So I'll jump in while people add additional questions, but I guess this is a question to Steve. In the option B, if a county pursues a sort of a planning process, and that could mean they're not drawing down the funds in the same way as others who are committed to programs, is that a disincentive to that county? Are they going to not get the funding because they're in a planning phase?
No, not at all. So essentially, the sequence of events is going to be that counties are now setting up these things called special revenue funds, which are a way to keep, they use these for a lot of federal grants. These are a way to keep track of special revenue streams. The counties that have signed on to the settlement, which is all 100 counties plus 17 municipalities, come April or as soon as possible, essentially they will get money wired to their special revenue funds by this national administrator. And so then they get the money up front. They then can pick either option A or option B, or a combination of option A and option B. But the fact that they decide to go through the planning process, they may spend some of that money on the planning process. And then once the planning process is over, they still have the balance sitting there in their account. So in other words, it's not like they would go through the planning process and then ask to get the money from the national administrator. The money's coming when the money's coming.
Okay,
Does that clarify that, Marvin?
Yeah. So here's a question for Teresa Coles. Thank you for the excellent talk. how will local health departments in North Carolina know what funds, resources will be available to them, and when will the funds be available?
I'll speak briefly about that. I may then also ask Daniel if he wants to chime in. So one thing to point out that is a weird aspect of this whole litigation is that it is government, it is the county board, it is the counties that sued, not the local health departments. And so the money, as I'm sure is obvious by now, is not going to the local health department, it's going to the counties and the municipalities to be ultimately be spent at the direction of the county boards, the city boards, and so forth. We already know, and you would certainly hope that this would be the case, that they would make those decisions in consultation with their local health directors and, you know, their EMS folks and so forth, all of the experts. To be much more concrete, we actually have a chart. Like what we have available right now is a chart on the website I mentioned, and I'll show it to you in just a second. And what that chart shows you is the maximum total amount over the entire period that your county or your municipality could get if all the stars aligned and none of the penalties kick in and everybody stays signed up and so forth. And I'm going to just take the liberty, I'm going to go ahead and show that to you. Let's see. Thought I had that up. I'll tell you what, Daniel, why don't you talk while I'm doing this and fill in any gaps that I've left.
So I'll just address the timing question. And as I said in my presentations, assuming everything goes forward, the distributor and J&J Janssen money sort of starts flowing on a national level on April 1st, basically, April 2nd, some day right at the beginning of April. I mean, there are going to be, especially in the first year, there are inevitably going to be some logistical challenges, especially just given the large amount of money we're talking about and the number of local governments across the country that will be eligible to receive payment. So I don't want people to walk away thinking on April 2nd, the wire's coming through to everyone's county bank account and city bank account with the money. It presumably is going to take, and there's some legal, there also needs to be some orders issued in North Carolina, at least by the Superior Court in Wake County to make it formal and everything. So it will not be the very first available day, will not be April 1st, but certainly this spring, I would anticipate that all those logistical challenges will be worked out, and we will be money will be wired to the relevant bank accounts in counties and municipalities. But it then will be, in most years, I think it's on a national level, the payment is roughly on July 15th, sort of going forward after this year. And so every July 15th or very shortly thereafter, additional payments will be made. And so that's, and I don't know, and so and just to be clear, because I know we've gotten a couple questions because there's been some confusion on this after the fact that the bankruptcy judge in Purdue did not, or the district court judge in Purdue did not approve that plan, and so they've sent it back for further negotiation. That does not delay in any way the $750 million that is coming from Janssen and the distributors. There's a separate, the number as of right now, based on the plan that was put forward, is roughly $100 million to North Carolina on the Purdue money. That's above and beyond the $750 million number. So at this point, that is entirely on pause. And I don't, depending on the various, there's a way that I could start flowing quite quickly. There's a way that could be delayed in years of appeals and litigation. So I don't have any timeline on that, concrete timeline on that $100 million. But the $750 million for North Carolina is still on track for roughly, as I said, this spring, sometime after April, beginning of April.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Daniel. And I am going to, just for the heck of it, show folks this. can you all see this? Do you see this,
Mhm.
Marvin?
Yes, yes.
So this is a website we put together a few years ago about opioid stuff. And there's now a tab here, opioid settlements, which I'm clicking on. Under opioid settlements, there's a general thing. There's a lot of documents related to the distributor, J&J settlements that Daniel talked about. And then there's a lot of information about that North Carolina Memorandum of Agreement. So let me click there. Under the information about the Memorandum of Agreement, there is a tab. Here's the total amount that your county or municipality could get. You click on this little tab. And so what this tells you is that if you're an Alamance County Commissioner, you're wondering how much money are you going to get? This is a starting point, which is you're going to get $8.8 million over 18 years. And so we hope to be, and so y'all should, I know many of you are, well, I'm sure every one of you is in a county. So you should check out your county. And for the larger municipalities here, City of Asheville, Charlotte, Concord, Durham, et cetera, you can look at that as well. So I just wanted to point out the resources there, including very specifically that total number. And we hope to have more specifics, as we get closer to April about, what percent of that are you actually going to get in your early payments. But I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. Here's a question from Michelle Easter, which I think is on a lot of our minds, that with so many counties, municipalities, potentially trying many different approaches, there'll be a lot of natural experiments and lessons learned. Are there current plans for for evaluations? And what would be your advice for researchers who would like to partner with counties, municipalities to study outcomes or provide technical assistance? What's your thoughts about that? We understand that most of that would not come under the settlement funding, but is there any way to organize this or plug into that?
Yeah, my answer to that is that I think that's a great topic for us collectively to discuss, because particularly we have so many great research institutions and think tanks and nonprofits and so forth here in North Carolina that are already doing a lot of great work. I'm aware, for example, of all of the work, Marvin, that you and Allison and Michelle or others doing, studying some of the diversion programs already up and running in North Carolina. I would love to have that conversation with you as an ongoing conversation. A couple things I'll note. I do think North Carolina, I don't have time, and I am going to have to hop off at about 2 minutes to 1 to get ready for my next call, but I don't have time to go into too much detail about the annual impact reports that I mentioned. But I do think North Carolina will be, if not unique, certainly in the lead as far as getting information out there publicly about what kinds of programs are getting funded and how much money is going to them, and some types of outcome data. And so while I don't anticipate, I don't see a lot of actual opioid settlement money going directly to evaluation. It's not out of the question. And I also think we could maybe work together collectively to look at, opportunities for other funding to essentially go to, NIH or foundations or whatever and say, look, North Carolina is uniquely positioned to evaluate some of the work that we're doing. We have a lot more information here than other states are going to have. As far as upfront technical assistance, I mentioned the dashboard. I mentioned the work between us and the county commissioners and DHHS. To the extent folks are currently funded or able to provide technical assistance, I know, for example, the Duke Opioid Collaboratory does some of that work, and I know Nidhi Sachdeva is on the call. Let's have that conversation now, because that's something we can make sure that we share with counties immediately, that, hey, if you're thinking about funding a syringe service program, or you want to know how to implement one, DHHS has folks, but so does the Duke Opioid Collaboratory or whatever. We would want to be able to provide that information up front. So I hope I hope this starts a conversation rolling with you, Marvin, and your colleagues and the folks at our other great research institutions and organizations.
Great, great. Thanks very much. I know we just have probably time for one more question. So let me drop that. I guess one of the underlying questions a lot here is that there's such a problem with lack of capacity in the substance abuse or opioid treatment system. What are your thoughts about the impact the money can have in terms of improving access? Because it's been so underfunded for so long.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And, I think, sort of don't shoot the messenger, but the opioid settlement funding is not like a silver bullet to solve these just chronic problems with our behavioral health system in nationally, but even more so in North Carolina, frankly. And you all know that probably better than I do, but we have a very messed up system. And I don't think the opioid settlement is really going to solve that problem. I think Medicaid expansion would go a long way to solving that problem in the long term, because there would be greater funding for some of the folks with the greatest needs. So I don't have a good answer to that. I don't think the opioid settlement really solves these chronic underlying structural problems with our behavioral health system.
Right. Well, let me stop there because I know we need to let you go, Steve. But I want to really thank you and Daniel for this great opportunity to hear about this and pick your brains, and let's make this a conversation we continue. We'll take up your offer because we
absolutely
for all kinds of reasons we'd like to help. So thanks everybody that participated, and hopefully we'll have more discussions about this. Thanks, a great everyone. Day. Hope you don't get inundated with snow.
Well, we shall see. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.